I think we'll get started. I think we might have another couple of people coming in, but, so good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this important conversation about children and technology. In recent months, we've seen a surge of news stories drawing attention to the link between youth mental health and the use of social media. From alarming statistics on anxiety and depression among children and teens, to heartbreaking stories of social isolation and cyberbullying, it's clear that we're at a pivotal moment in understanding how technology impacts our younger generations. Just this year, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a powerful advisory on social media use, emphasizing the urgent need to address its role in shaping the mental and emotional well-being of our kids. His message was clear. While technology and social platforms offer connection and educational opportunities, they also pose significant risks if not managed carefully. In the context of this national conversation, folks like The Anxious Generation have fueled further dialogue, shedding light on how today's hyper-connected world is reshaping childhood, often in ways we aren't prepared for. As educators, parents, and community members, it's critical that we come together to explore ways we can help our children navigate this digital landscape in healthy, mindful ways. Tonight, we'll delve into strategies for fostering responsible tech use among young children, balancing screen time, and nurturing their mental health in a world that's increasingly dependent on technology. With that, I would like to introduce Chrissy Kashni to lead us through this discussion. Chrissy started her career as a teacher and literacy specialist. She eventually moved into school leadership, with her last post being the lower school head at the Foot School in New Haven. Along the way, she picked up another degree in psychology and education from Teachers College, was a consultant for Cricket Education Media, and was an academic leader for Studigy and e-learning platform. She is the founder of Advise, an educational consulting firm for families, children, and educators. So, Chrissy, thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for having me. I want to add a few things on to Carissa's really thoughtful introduction. It isn't lost on me that the same year that the Surgeon General put out this huge label and warning around social media use, that they also came out and said parents are more taxed and stressed than ever. It's a really, I don't know that they realized that, but there is a connection there. And I know a lot of the information that came out along with that second announcement was grounded in just the expectations around parenting. I have 3 kids. They're almost 14, 12, and almost 9. So it's real. I can say I can relate to it. Even with all of this professional background and experience that I have, in my own home, I'm still doing what you all are doing and trying to make the best choices and trying to navigate it and figure it out. My husband will often say, but you just know. You're supposed to know this stuff, so just tell me what we should do with the kids. As educators know, when you're emotionally involved with the child, all bets are kind of off. So the other thing I want to add to my introduction is that there was a part of the work that I've done more recently that was focused specifically in the online safety space for children. I was fortunate enough to support and work within a behavior-based nonprofit that specifically works to combat and lessen the child exploitation and online sex abuse. And so I feel like I had spent a lot of time in my career consulting and working with tech companies, right as Common Core was coming out, and then after as apps and whatnot were becoming a real thing. And then that opportunity kind of sealed the deal for me in terms of really taking a deeper dive into this idea of how do we take a step back from thinking about those middle school and high school students and what can we be doing with our younger children. And you're going to hear me repeat a couple of things over and over again, one of them being, my hope tonight is to help you all feel like you have a basis for the start of conversations. Conversations, I think someone had already mentioned, I got a real little one. Conversations that you may not be needing to have exactly in this moment, but being able to plant the seeds in structural ways with how you introduce technology in your home will help you have a strong foundation to have those conversations as they get older. I'm gonna ask a quick favor, just to kind of get a sense of who we are as a community tonight. Can you raise your hand if you have sort of like 2 to 5-year-old in your house? And if you can raise your hand multiple times, you have multiple kids. Okay, thank you. How about like 6 to 8? Okay. And anybody have that like 9 to 11? Okay, awesome. I got to hang out with the 4th and 5th graders yesterday. It was so fun. I'm not gonna lie. I was saying to Carissa, like, they were just on fire, and I went in so many different directions and I hadn't anticipated because they were so engaged in really, really exciting ways that I'll talk about as I go through the presentation. This is our general plan tonight. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about child development at this age, kind of where to begin when thinking about planning to introduce technology, although we all probably have it in our homes already, and that's okay. Planning what works for your family and how do you approach that. I want to talk a little bit about digital limits. I am going to take a brief pause to address social media and online access, just because it is just the elephant in the room. But it is really a whole separate, deeper dive conversation that I hope tonight will help this community start and then continue in ways that work well for you all. I want to share some resources, some ideas around sample planning for your family, and then get into some questions and answers. So it is really research, we now actually have research, I should say, that supports the idea that it isn't when we introduce technology, it's how we introduce technology. It's there, it's in our lives, it's in our children's lives, it's not going anywhere. And so being able to look at the growing body of research, sure, there's all of that research that's looking at social emotional well-being, but there's also research that's now more and more looking at brain development, how it's changing things as much as posture in humans, and a whole range of things that impacts how we think about technology. So that's really our focus tonight. You're gonna hear me talk a lot about it's not an either or. It's not a, do you give your child a phone or do you not give your child a phone? Do you give them an iPad or do you not give them an iPad when they're 5 years old? I believe that those are decisions that are grounded in a broader context for individual families. And I still feel it's important for parents to know the underpinnings. What is the research? What is the cognitive development that's going on at this age? So then you can think about what works best for your family. The other thing I'll add, and I can use my own house as an example for one of these, there are other extenuating circumstances. In my house, we have made decisions around technology based on the medical needs of one of our children. And that's a fact. It's something that is a necessity that we had to put in place to make sure that we could set up a safe environment in certain situations for him. I work with families who assistive technology is how one of their family members communicates. And so that has impacted how technology is used. So there's all these nuances and we can't tease them all apart tonight, but I hope there'll be enough here that you'll be able to apply it to your own circumstances and your own family. So I don't know if anybody knows, there's an interesting gentleman named Guy Kawasaki. Anybody heard of that? Okay, he's got a really great framework for when you're public speaking. 10 slides, 20 minutes, 30-point font. I am going to break every one of those rules tonight, so I want to acknowledge that early on. And I'm not going to read through everything on here. I can share the presentation with Carissa to pass along for folks. My hope is just that there's information and nuggets that you can take with you. What I want to highlight here is that, and it's helpful to hear the range of folks and the children that you have in your homes. But you're probably really well aware that whether or not they're 3 or they're 10, they're starting to pull away. They're learning how to regulate their emotions. They're learning how to see perspective. These are all things that by design as humans, we know and we have studied in real life with humans. If you think about how that then impacts layering over technology, it gets complicated. And I'm not here to say that technology can't replace some of those ideas. I think there's research that supports it, but I advocate for families to understand if my child's trying to figure out how to regulate their emotions when their sibling takes away their toy, I can anticipate that when we think about our family plan for technology, I need to think about how that separation from that device is going to look. And again, there's no right or wrong, but it's just knowing your child. It's also knowing this child might be able to just walk away from it, yet my other child, it's going to be like a whole other experience that we have to kind of plan around. And again, it doesn't mean that one child is handling things better than another. It's their individuality is going to play into that. And I'm going to talk about that from the sibling relationship piece a little later on. So once you think about sort of where your child is and understanding their cognitive development, and you think about what do we need in our house and what makes sense, you can start thinking about a family plan. And what I advocate for is to think about core values for your family. What are the benefits? There are definitely benefits to technology in a variety of ways. And some of it can be as simple as, I need to make dinner. You know, like that's a reality. And I'm here to say that as parents, we have to give ourselves permissions to know when it's something that is a necessity, when it's something that's a need, and when it's something that's a want. And those are things we talk to our kids about. And I would also advocate, and we'll talk a little bit more later on about this, the idea that it's okay to use that language and model that with our children. I need to cook dinner. Would you like to help me? I would love to have your help if you don't feel like cooking is something that you want to do right now. Would you like to sit with me and, you know, have something as a choice for the 10 minutes that I'm gonna need to chop this up or whatever. So again, like there's a ton of examples, but in terms of the core values, looking at benefits for your family as a whole, concerns you might have. They might be based on their age, they might be based on access, but just make a running list. You don't have to have the answers to them. Think about structure, and I say that from the perspective of daily schedule, school schedule, parental schedule, grandparent, other caregiver involvement, and then what questions do you have? And once you sort of have a look and a frame for how that can come together, then you can start taking a look at, well, what kind of device fits our needs based on what we feel the benefits are, the concerns, and where we see our structure. Think about the platforms and the apps from there. Identifying a device based on your child's skill set makes a lot of sense. And from the perspective of wanting to make sure that, you know, if it is a Kindle Fire tablet, my purpose is that I really want to make them able to have access to books, and I want them to have some educational apps. You know, it's that whole idea of, do you need the base model, or do you need sort of the fully tricked out option, and what's best going to serve your needs, and what's going to help the child have an experience that's in alignment with your plan. Understanding platforms and apps, I'm going to be really honest, and most of you probably already know this. There's no easy way around this. You're just gonna have to keep learning and keeping up with what's happening. It changes faster than even the experts can keep up with this. There's a lot of great resources and tools online that help you at least get an initial understanding. But it's one of those things that I say is partly contributing to that parent sort of stress factor in terms of we're constantly trying to figure out what is the right technology for them to use, what's the right sports team for them to excel in this area, what's the school that they should be part of, and then it just kind of all trickles together. And then shaping guidelines and utilizing resources that are a good fit for your family values. I'm going to share some towards the end. I have selected them because I feel like they're really broad and balanced. There are ones I will say that if your technology plan and use has other factors that are contributing like to part of your choices, there are a lot of resources that you know, sort of can go in a variety of different directions that I'm happy to share as well. And then if I drill down a tiny bit further, the three areas that I like to break things into are high quality, your family habits, and balance. And this is where I want to sort of weave in my chance to get to hang out with the students yesterday, because we talked about that quality piece. And I use this phrase, not all screen time is created equal. And to share an anecdote from yesterday, I put that up on a piece of paper. There were a few other questions up on paper around the room as well, and the students had a chance to go around and leave comments and questions or statements about those. This one, though, is the only one that said, agree or disagree. And it was fascinating, and I explained to them that I was excited because they sort of did something different than has happened in a lot of communities I've visited. they all said that they agreed. And so the teachers and I wanted to drill down a little bit further into this idea, and so we asked them, what did you think that that statement meant? Not assuming that they were interpreting it the way I intended. And it was fascinating. Some of them said it just had to do with the type of device. Well, you know, a Switch is different than a PlayStation, and then one student was cute. He shared. He said, "Oh, well, you know, like an iPhone 8 is nowhere near like an iPhone 13, for example." And so, but this is what the way that they could articulate that this was their understanding of that question was so on par developmentally. They took that question very literally, and it was both beautifully innocent and really helpful for us to make that next extension, which was when I said, you all have great definitions, and I'm gonna share mine, which is just as good as yours, but a little bit different. And I talked to them about the idea that I equate screen time equity to the food pyramid. And they got a good chuckle out of that. Because I said, who here likes dessert? And so we had a whole dessert discussion, which was great. Learned a lot about their favorite sugars. But they, I said, so how do you feel after you have a lot of dessert? And it was a few of them, said they feel great. One student was like, I actually feel really tired the next day. And I was like, I appreciate the honesty. That's how I feel after a lot of dessert, but yes, I know that my children will tell you the same thing. So we talked about this idea that there are snacks, there are fruits and vegetables, and there's desserts. And I told them that that's kind of a framework we use in our house to talk about what the different types of screen times are. And I have liked that analogy for a long time because it doesn't matter if a child's 4, 10, or you're an adult, you're always gonna understand what dessert is. You're always gonna know what fruits and vegetables are. And so it's a nice way to break down what the rest of the statement says, which talks about like comparing educational value to messaging, to low sensory opportunities. PBS is a great example of this. I don't know anybody with young children or with older children who remembers Super Y, but it's a great example. If you look at how the graphics are displayed on the screen, they're very low sensory. If you also look at the tone of voice of the characters, if you look at sort of the pace of the show, PBS is known for doing one of the best sort of intentional sort of stop and pause throughout the show. That's like the point where if it's on in the other room, you're like, is it still playing? Or if you're watching it, you're like, why are they pausing? But they're intentionally trying to create an active engagement moment for the child to have an opportunity to think about what has just been asked and either respond in their head, or some kids will just say it out loud, depending on their personality. And I want to make a connection to that example to when I look at the family habits, this idea of co-watching or co-viewing. And this is where I go back to, there's a reality of all of this. We're not all going to sit down and watch every show our child or children watch, or be able to do it maybe a majority of the time. But it's the kind of thing where it falls under that idea of modeling. I also like to talk about co-watching or co-viewing, or even participating with a child, especially when you get to a place where you're starting to think about introducing a gaming device. Gaming devices do have benefits to them. There are some really interesting adults who have studied it and actually talk from a research-based perspective on this. And the one thing that kind of goes hand in hand with it, though, is that idea of like, how does my child problem solve and how do they handle frustration? And so by co-playing, even if you play Mario Kart once with them, or even if it's a new game and you want to see how they try it out, it's helpful from the perspective of, especially at the younger ages, as they're learning to moderate and regulate their emotions and their responses, to just be able to see it in action. And it may not be that you swoop in as a parent in that moment to sort of fix it and make it all better, but you have an awareness of this is tricky for them, they're working on it, and maybe it's a follow-up conversation later at the dinner table, or when you're driving in the car to say, hey, that was tricky. I sensed that was tricky. Did you figure it out? Like, you can also kind of not make it seem so much of an assumption, like you're assuming that they just couldn't do it and they fell apart, but it's a point of conversation. And the reason why I say that is that simple, seemingly simple, surface level conversation later, and when I'll talk about this in a minute, when they are online, later when they are potentially on social media, if that's something you introduce in your family, there's going to be conversations that you're going to want and need to have around what happens if somebody sends you a message and you don't know who they are. And it seems like a bit of a stretch, but just having that foundation of I'm asking a question about technology use and I'm not making it threatening really starts to set a tone for this is how we talk about technology in our house. And to go along with that, this isn't a new thing, but I like to bring it up. It's that idea of, as we're trying to model, narrating what we're doing. So I don't know about you all, but my kids always have a question when I'm trying to respond to an email on my phone or a text, and I'm trying to concentrate. And they'll either run into the room, or sometimes I'll just be something urgent that I have to get to in that moment, and so there we are all in the room together. And instead of kind of like a tendency that a lot of us might have to have that, is they're like, hold on a second, or I'm in the middle of something. I recommend and suggest, try to stretch it out further. I'm writing a message, if it's somebody to know, to so-and-so, because I'm trying to coordinate that play date for later. So helping them just to understand what the intention and the purpose is takes, my phone away, sorry. It takes that sort of abstract, like what is my parent doing on the phone? And again, because later on at some point, you might be saying to them, what are you up to? Or what are you in the middle of right now? Can you talk? And introducing the idea to them, oh, I'm texting Joe because we're gonna go for a bike ride. It's just setting that up for down the road in a way that it doesn't make it seem like it's out of the realm of possibility that we have a family conversation about what we're engaging with on digital devices. Balance. Yeah, that's like a whole parenting topic on its own. But in terms of digital time, I like to talk about it from the perspective of, I think because of the media, because of all the books coming out, because of the Surgeon General warnings and whatnot, we feel like technology and screen time is so much a part of our pie. And in reality, it's a part of our pie in our family. So I encourage folks to think about how do you define balance with play, movement, human connection, time in nature, and rest. And so it also helps to think about this idea of, I feel like we're only talking about screen time all the time. So when you're having your screen time or family conversation around technology, build that into the conversation when you're talking about how does technology fit into our family. Specifically say, okay, well, we're planning for that, and we plan for screen time our day. When do we think about, and when do we make sure that we're out in nature? Or when are we doing movement together? Oh wait, you have soccer on that day. Again, it's just about making a whole pie and not constantly emphasizing and focusing solely on the limits, the screen time, the apps, because it just ends up making it seem like it's an either or for the kids and taking away from that idea that there are many other aspects to their day and their world. So I wanted to talk about digital limits for a minute, and I'm actually going to change the language later on. You're going to hear me talk about digital limits in a different way, and I'll explain why then. But it's limits, and as somebody was saying earlier, I don't remember if it was Carissa or where, the idea that even when I first became a parent almost 14 years ago, iPad was new on the scene, and the discussion was, don't put it in front of your kid. No why, no do this or else, don't even put them on FaceTime, it was just a big don't. And from that sort of started this whole idea about limiting. And we have the benefit now of there being some really good research. There's actually a study that was done that looked at 3 different groups. Sort of like the easy adopters, the here, you take it and run with it kid. The people who put a ton of limits on their children around devices. And then this other group called the digital mentors. The digital mentors were the group that had the conversations, that when and as part of introduction to technology, they were having conversations. And the study showed that over the long term, these are the families, or these are the kiddos that had greater success with continuing the conversations as they got older. focusing on how technology makes us feel. So having conversations within our house, having that conversation with a child who is having the hard time ending at the end of the time, you know, saying, I know that that feels really hard. A lot of times I recommend also, if that's the moment that's happening for the child, there's a lot of work that's done around resilience and building resilience in children. We were talking about this a little bit before everybody showed up. But from the perspective of the more stories that we can tell of hard times that we had or things that were tricky for us that we had to work through, and the research actually supports even like grandparents telling these stories is even stronger effects on children. But it de-escalates, it validates the child's experience, but it also shows them in a way, I'm not crazy. What do you mean my mom has a hard time, you know, when she has to stop X? Or she has a hard time when she doesn't feel like doing that, you know, one particular thing. It's them hearing the perspective that will help them to also kind of see their own growth and progress along the way in the conversation. Making real world connections with digital experiences, emphasizing critical thinking, and openly discussing screen time boundaries as a family, and having a conversation, open conversation about safety. Again, I'm gonna say here, I like to encourage parents to think about, at this age, we talked about the emphasis on kids being in person, being with other adults, being with other kids. What's a natural conversation we might have with the kids at this age? Maybe stranger danger? Maybe knowing when something doesn't feel right. So have those conversations. We tend to have those conversations, especially when they're going into a new situation. Think about now, or at least start thinking about now, what might that conversation look like or evolve to when and if online access is something that becomes available. And even if it is connected with initially, that idea that right now developmentally, if they're feeling frustration inside of an app, how does that feel? Come and tell me when you're frustrated. So you just start teaching them that go-to at an early age. If it's a 6-year-old and they're playing an educational app and they can't get to the next level because they haven't mastered the skill, if you're frustrated, come and get me and we can look at it together. So again, it's just laying that groundwork for as they get older and what that might look like if it's a conversation that's more about safety and access online. So this is my plug for dopamine. Oh, dopamine. So I have to say that the online assets piece is complicated for a lot of reasons. And when we look at what 6 to 10-year-olds have the maturity to deal with, it is pretty much in the world that's right in front of them. There's very little about their cognitive development that can extrapolate and take it to the level that is sort of beyond the things that are in front of them. I think where things get tricky, and this is an ongoing conversation as well, is what about FaceTime? Because they're seeing their friends. A lot of the families I've actually been in touch with recently around this and have had questions like, oh, but they don't get to see their camp friends all year long after, and they want to see them in between. So that's okay. I think that's, you know, an example of where if you feel like your child is comfortable in those conversations, what I say to families is that think about in terms of your family plan, is it a conversation you would want to happen in an open space where other families members are? Is it, and I'm not saying this solely for safety, but I'm saying this from, if we think back, I might be dating myself, to when we were in elementary school, like I had to go answer a phone on a wall, and that was the only way I could communicate with you. So you were talking in front of everybody, or you weren't answering the phone and talking to whoever was on the other end of the line. And so I say that as an example of, we don't have to have our children live the way we did. There are advances for a reason, but are there things that are lessons learned from our childhood that we can make an extension to and have work in the context of what they have access to today? I want to talk about dopamine for one more second because we didn't talk about it yesterday. And I have to say, it was another adorable moment with the group because I brought up this idea of like, you know, even if you're just, you know, doing an educational app, you know, there are things built in that sort of make you want to play that game longer. And they have an impact on this part of your brain that makes dopamine. And dopamine is like something your brain's been making for a very long time for a lot of good reasons, but it also does it when you're, interacting with a device. And I said, so does anybody know what dopamine actually is? And I got some amazing and beautiful responses. One student went, "It's what makes you happy." And they were right. And so it then actually started a really good conversation amongst them. I took a step back about that idea, about knowing sort of like what it is about interacting with technology and how it may make it like you want more dessert, and kind of knowing when you've had enough dessert or when just being aware of how dopamine affects your interaction with technology. The other thing I like to talk about in terms of online access and social media, and again, it's not to do it or not to do it, but just to think about the idea, what need does it fill right now? There are families who will flat out say, they're generally in middle school and high school, my child really wants a scholarship for college, and this is what they need to do as part of their program with their coach to be able to have access. There are other families that say, most of our family doesn't live nearby, so I have a closed social media and my kids are on it. There are many reasons why there might be a need that fits your family value, and that's okay. And then the biggest question is just the idea, is my child ready? The last thing I'll say about online access is these are 4 questions I encourage families to think about. Their individual child, not the whole family of children, when they're considering giving online access. The first is, what do my child's critical thinking and problem-solving skills look like? Fortunately, it's something you get feedback on from the school too, usually, so you can incorporate that as well. How does my child do with keeping track of things? Is my child easily influenced by others? And if my child runs into an issue, will they come and tell me? I think most of those are pretty obvious. The one I often get questions about is, how does my child do with keeping track of things? There may be some psychology experts in here in the room, and feel free to contribute because I'm going to way oversimplify this for the purposes of this conversation. But basically, there are executive functioning skills that develop over time, and certain, as they come together, there's a connection with being able to do some higher order and some more complex tasks. You don't have to know the ins and outs of it, just know, how is my child doing at this age, keeping track of their belongings? How are they doing with remembering 2- and 3-step directions? Again, those aren't meaning that they should go online, but it's just a marker for you in terms of how it is that they're doing with executive functioning skills, and it does play a role into how ready or how much growth might be needed when you're considering online access. So here's where I flip the language a little bit. So instead of saying limits, I talk about boundaries. Because I think that when we continue the conversation about limits, we're still kind of stuck in that early idea of around how technology use can take shape in our homes. So this, I'm going to kind of go through quickly. If someone wants a little bit more information around the setup and how it works, I'm going to get into a little bit. But basically, when it comes to support with boundaries, both Apple and Android have a lot that's built in. Some of it takes a bit of work. I'm going to talk a little bit about some examples in a minute. And Kindle and gaming devices have features that allow you to limit screen time, limit online access, and all of that. The one thing I will say about the Kindle devices, if you don't have one and you're considering one, they do have a unique feature, especially around sort of their book access and their app access, where you put in your child's age range. So if they're 5, you might say they're 4 to 6, or you might say 5 to 7, depending on sort of your own child's growth and development. But it's automatically going to set parameters around what comes onto their screen. I'll say the other added benefit to that is, if you're like me, you forget things like that after you set them up, and your child gets a year older or 2 years older, and they're not asking for anything different potentially than what's in front of them. So it's the kind of thing where if your child's appetite is satisfied by the content in front of them, then you might want to ride that out a little bit more, because they're not necessarily asking for something that they're, is a little bit more advanced. It's a little bit of a trick, I know, but it's one of those things where there is a little bit of a serendipitous in it in terms of their access and how it grows. There are monitoring tools out there. Most of them are at a cost. I'm going to share a couple, but they are worth doing the research for. Even if you don't incorporate them into your home now, it's just good to know that they're out there. There are, if you are on social media, there's some good Facebook groups. I'll share one of them a little bit later, where you can just ghost in the group for now and just gather all the information, because there are parents who are navigating it, and these support groups are great places just to hear how other people are approaching it. And education. I list a couple here: Common Sense Media, Kids in Mind, Thorn for Parents. They're just great resources. I love them because they're resources for parents, but they also have kid components. Thorns for Parents kid component is called No Filter, and it's mainly a social media. They do have a website push. So it's good as parents to go and look at that, again, more so for down the road. And they also do a great job of giving prompts. So if you're not sure how to start a conversation, if you're not sure which conversation you want to be having, when, you can take a look and just kind of be able to see what is available and kind of line it up with how that fits with your plan and access in your home. What might a family plan look like? I'm going to date myself again. I don't know if anybody used to watch Sandra Lee on the Food Network channel. Oh yes, there's one person. Okay, thank you. I loved her for her baking, but it was mainly for her philosophy, which was half of it is sort of like pre-made, like you use like a boxed cake, but then it's kind of how ingredients you use, how you pull it together, and what you make around it, how it comes together. There's no reason to do this from scratch. I told Carissa I'll share these links. These are templates from Common Sense Media. I actually purposely put up the 2 to 8 one. There's one for like 9 to 11. I like this one, and I've used this one in our house because I like the way it breaks down the buckets. But you can also print them out and combine them and fill them out together with your partner first in your home, or include your kids early on. And they're just great for having conversations and starting a plan. I think the considerations when it talks about introduction of access and the devices you pick, one of the biggest, I think, most powerful conversations that you can have, and I actually encourage you to lean on friends in this case, is what is necessary versus convenient for adults. It's not to say, again, that you should or you shouldn't do it, but it's just being aware of it. The other thing I'll say about conversations within peer communities, and I know that that's part of Carissa's goal, is to sort of have an ongoing conversation here, is that some of the most enriching conversations that I have had have been with parents whose views are the complete opposite of mine. It hasn't necessarily made me change what I'm doing in the moment, but it has made me, there's always been a nugget. There's always been that there was something that was a reason that they had for something that they had in place or did not have in place that informed what I did moving forward, if that makes sense. And so it's tough because I joke that the other tricky part about these conversations is, a lot of times, and we're a small group tonight, so we can do this a little bit, I usually have folks kind of turn, say your kid's age, and then also talk about like one thing that's just sort of on your mind with technology. The awkwardness in that is often, it's kind of like, is when your kids are little and it's like, you don't want to admit whether they're potty trained or not. Like it's just one of those parenting things where there's another opportunity potentially for judgment. And so it can be really hard to have a conversation, and especially I think for elementary age families, because I think, listen, most middle school and high school families, it's just a matter of, are you holding out or not? Like with the phone. And that's a whole separate conversation that's really tough to navigate for a variety of reasons. But I think in the elementary years, what feels hard is it's just sort of like, is my kid online, or is your kid online? Or when they come to your home for a play date, are they gonna be on a device, or are they not gonna be on a device? And those are really hard and awkward conversations to have. I can say from families I've worked with in my own personal experience that I have actually often bonded more so with some families when I've just put that awkward question out there. And even if our views were different, it was just sort of like, we both would breathe. Like, cause it was just like, oh, okay, that's what you're doing. Oh, that's what you're doing. and then we could move forward. So I'm a big advocate for just not only finding your group, or meaning like the people who are like-minded, but finding the people who aren't doing things the same way that you're doing it. But what type of a device is a good fit for your child and at what age? I want to spend a moment here talking about the idea that just as no technology is created equal, no two children are created the same. So I just want to advocate for, it's okay for different children in your home to have access to different devices and for that to happen at different times. Not every 9-year-old or 11-year-old or 5-year-old meets milestones at the same time. Gets a little complicated with twins, sorry. But it's a fact. And part of the work that I had done early in my career was around identity formation and sibling relationships. So if I look at that research, and I look at about the human piece in terms of like taking technology out of it, one of the best things we can do with siblings in our families is talk to them about their individuality, and also not just say, oh, well, your brother did this, so really you should do this now. It's no different with technology. It gets more complicated, but saying things just like everybody's gonna get a phone when they're 13 may not be a right fit for everyone. And that, again, it's complicated for us as parents. It's actually, in some ways, harder for us as parents to look at it that way. And it's something that, from the child perspective, is really beneficial. It just helps each individual child see their individuality acknowledged in a way. And trust me, there's definitely the pushback you'll get if it is that it's approached differently. And at the end of the day, if that's not what works in your family, that's okay as well, but it's something I like to point out. How will we reinforce guidelines and rules in our family? I would say that's probably the most important conversation to have as a whole family. And I'll point out for 2 reasons. One, the whole what's gonna happen when your boundary is set is the conversation. It doesn't mean that it's going to be sunshine and rainbows when the boundary comes and happens, but at least you can say, remember we talked about, and maybe you come up with strategies. You know, maybe if it's with a 5 or 6-year-old, it's saying, okay, if it's really hard, what would you like? What can we do next? And maybe it's about well, you'll play a card game with me, mommy, or it's just something that will help them move to that next step. The other thing that I'll say about that is a little anecdote from home. So we do have my oldest does have a phone, but even before he did, we set a no device at the table rule. We said device generally so that Kindle didn't make its way to the table. My husband and I were intentional about not having our phones at the table. Well, inevitably, for one of us for work, at some moments, there would be something that would be an immediate, we had to take care of it. And so we would get up, we'd leave the table. Well, there was one evening, and I'm not throwing my husband under the bus, this really happened. He had something that came up that was urgent. He got a text, he took his phone out of his pocket, he started to write, and my youngest was like, well, Daddy, there's no phones at the table. So it was a great moment in terms of knowing that our youngest wanted to reinforce the boundary. I will say the other question that actually I didn't anticipate, or I said part of that I didn't anticipate, was we actually had a really good conversation about how do you tell somebody they're breaking the boundary nicely. Because it's that whole idea of I hadn't thought about that concept of yes, we talk nicely about the boundaries and do all that, but for an 8-year-old, they're just excited to catch their parent breaking the rule. So I put that out there as just something else to consider. And then how often will we reevaluate or adjust this plan? And I put that there just so that everybody has an understanding that it's going to be fluid. What we decide today may not work as well in 6 months or a year. I also put that up there for everybody in this room. As parents, we can change our mind. We can change how we feel we should be approaching things. And I get that question often with this presentation because somebody will say, what if you've talked about something that I know I want to change at home now? And my answer to that is have a conversation. And it's okay to say, and involve children in it, to say, you know, we've been doing it this way, and just as we all want to be lifelong learners in our family, I'm trying to learn more about technology because it's changing so much, and I've learned something, and you can be specific, that has made me think, maybe our plan should adjust in this way. What do you think? And so fold them into it, and it doesn't have to be a, we're doing this because I said so, but again, it's what do you think about this? You know, how do you think it makes sense? And they may flat out say, no, I don't like it. They may say all of those things. But it also doesn't have to be something where it's one conversation and it's one and done. It can also be a way to model, okay, I'm glad you said that, I want to think about it. And then you come back to it later that day or the next day. But it is the idea that technology is evolving, and we're not gonna be able to keep up with it in the same way, or there's gonna be an app comes up with a new access or a new component to it that just totally goes against whether or not you think the child should be involved in it. I'm going really long, I'm sorry. So I'll go quickly over this, but I can, again, Chris, I'll give you everything so that everybody can have access to it. If you're trying to set things up, the Kindle Fire, they're pretty straightforward with in terms of, and this is an old, they just literally like 2 weeks ago updated their like sort of their look, so it's kind of set up a little differently now. But you can set up bedtime, you can set up screen access. Like the nice thing is that it's real easy just to make it a reading Kindle, even though there is app access. The age-appropriate content, and you can, it's a device, some people don't realize this, you can use third-party apps like Disney or Zoom, if for any reason that was something that was part of your family plan for your child, and it doesn't have to, a lot of people say, oh, I need the iPad because, but the Kindle Fire does allow third-party access to many things. And one of the only downfalls I will say is if you are offline, so if you're traveling, you don't have Wi-Fi access, you must pre-download the content ahead of time. In terms of, this is an iPhone setup, but I will say that it applies to iPads as well. The one thing I will say, without going into the specifics, and if people want more of a step-by-step guide, I can share one with you. The thing to remember with these devices, whether it is an Android or whether it is an iOS setup, it's not all or nothing. So I'll use my son as an example. He's in 8th grade, he has a phone. His phone allows him to text his mom, text his dad, text his 2 grandmothers, and text his 2 grandfathers, and call them, and that's it. We have chosen to do a scaffolded model, which he has a device. We did choose to give him a smartphone. Everything else is disabled on it. You can turn the camera off. You can limit it as much as you want to. We chose that, again, for 2 reasons we chose that particular device. One was convenient. We had a very old SE sitting in the house, and we just said we can make it like a Gab phone or whatever and just take advantage of that for now. So it was sort of like a practical financial decision. And the other was we chose this particular model because right now for him, our goal is for him to start to learn some of the nuances around texting and around making phone calls, but we don't want him to open the floodgates to be able to do that socially yet. So he's just happy he has a phone. It's interesting in middle school, it's sort of like you have the look, but nobody knows that they're not hearing from him. Might also be the difference between boys and girls, I'm not gonna lie. The communication limits, I will say, so that's an area where you can choose, he can't edit his contacts. So his contacts stay completely uneditable, he can't add. If somebody, Android does this as well, tries to text him, like let's say he gave his number out to a friend, and they tried to text him, it goes separate, it shows a phone number, but the entire message he has no access to. So like the spam stuff that comes through by text now, because everybody gets it, it just goes into an invisible space where he can't see it. Again, I'm not sharing that because it's the right way to do it, but just so folks know that it's not that either or. You can set it up in a way that's in between. Google Family Link is similar, and they have all those same access as well. And in both cases with Google Family Link and with Apple, you can set your phone up, so I can actually go in. If I did want to add a contact into my son's phone, I could go right into the parental controls for his phone from my phone. And Google Family Link has the same thing. And I say this again because iPad, so if your child does have an iPad, you can do a similar setup and you can set it up. The tricky part with the iPad is it's not as easily set up as the sort of the parent piece as it is with an iPhone, but there's still a way to work around it. I will also add one last bit in terms of if you use yourself an iPhone or an Android, it's not impossible for your child to be on a different device and for you still to be able to have access to having parental controls over them. For a long period of time, I had an Android and it wasn't long, actually that long, but for a period of time, I had an Android and he had an iPhone, and then vice versa. You can put Family Link app on an iPhone and still have control. So, monitoring services. So these are 3 I recommend. They're each kind of serve a little bit of a different purpose. I recommend looking into all of them. Bark is one that they also have a phone. They have a really robust parent network. In Facebook, it's called Parenting in a Tech World. All of it's monitored in terms of there's a moderator who kind of oversees the group, but there's a lot of interesting and helpful conversations that take place. Circle and Aura are also really good resources, and again, it's thinking about also for yourself whether or not you want your resources to be whole network, you want it to be Wi-Fi based, or you want it to be device based. And again, there's no right or wrong, it just goes back to what works for your family. Smartphone alternatives, each of these companies have a smartphone alternative. You can get flip phones, it's actually kind of a thing. Again, it's just a matter of what's a good fit for your family and what's a good fit for your child. And now stop rambling. Sorry. I tried to shove a lot in, and there's probably a whole bunch that I didn't get to, but I hope some of it was helpful or there's a takeaway for you to be able to utilize. So, I know I went for a while, but I'm happy to stay as long as Carissa will let me answer questions and have further discussion. So, yeah.
What is the recommended age to start introducing technology to kids? My kid's 3. So I'm just kind of curious when is the recommended age to start that?
So I don't think that there is a specific, at this age, this should happen. I think it's a conversation. I mean, the American Academy of Pediatrics will give you ranges, and that's a helpful starting point. And especially since now they actually have research behind some of the recommendations that they're making. But I'll say that it's a great conversation to just have with the adults who are in your child's life, take advantage of the school, in terms of what do you see them doing in terms of meeting milestones? What do you see them in terms of doing in terms of interaction with others? I think things like how much eye contact does my child make when they're interacting with adults, those kinds of things are signs that they're sort of meeting milestones in a way that they might be ready for introduction. And then I think the question is what and how. And I think that question again goes back to sort of your individual child and what he or she is, how do they interact with toys? How do they handle frustration with a toy? And what do you and your family want to use the technology for? And again, there's no right or wrong. Your answer could be, I want them to be able to watch a 12-minute PBS show. Or on Amazon, they have some great short shows too for kids, if that's something that would be helpful. There are some interesting apps that actually have sort of manipulatives that sit in an iPad, and they're designed for toddlers and preschoolers. They're shapes, and they'll put a graphic up, and then they can put it on the device, and they can sort of match and kind of use it as a template for playing a game. So again, I think some of it is just kind of who they are and how are they in their own personal development, and then what it is that you feel would be a fit, or what would be the right match for what you want them to be doing on the device. that helpful?
It is.
I'm curious what your thoughts on our wait until 8th. I know there's not a general hard and fast rule that you necessarily have, but in thinking about what is one of the biggest things that can help kids in a community, like a school, wait to get a phone, things like parental packs or a similar promise made among parents. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that and how it works.
I have seen them be really positive in some communities. I've seen them be really positive even in like a subset of a community. It's been a way to sort of feel surrounded and to take that pressure off of like, I'm nervous that they're gonna be exposed or there's something's gonna happen in an environment that is just not part of my family plan right now. So I think there's a lot of positives to it. I think there's a lot of communities in our area where we're fortunate that they're not even doing it just school-based, they're sort of town-based community efforts. And I think some of those towns are even like just happy to have folks who want to participate and feel supported. So I'm happy to share some of the local groups too, if that would be helpful. And I think again, I had a conversation with someone recently who said, well, I had to give my child a device. They were the only one. And their social life was about over. And that's real. I think it's a different social pressure than, I would say it's a different pressure than we had. It's a different intensity than we had when we were growing up. I'm forever grateful I grew up when I did, for a lot of reasons. But I will say that my response to that parent was that I understand, and I think that there's real reason behind that pressure. I just advocate for that not to be the only reason. So if it is that you're there, it's sort of like, well, what other need or what other support does it offer right now in a way that, because I think for me, with that messaging to the child, I think the tricky balance is how that leads them to just walk away with the idea of social pressure. And so again, it's not, there's no right or wrong, it's just, I want people to feel like, because I think that's also, you feel like you're feeling the pressure as a parent because of the other parental choices. So, is that helpful? Yeah. A little bit of a ramble. It's tricky, and I want to also say, I'm not intentionally trying to like tiptoe and walk this fine line. The fine line's there, and I think we could probably all like open up and talk about what we're doing in our own homes really specifically. And even if we're like-minded, we're still doing it differently. Like I think that's the thing, the spectrum is so broad. And unfortunately, we're also living in a time where pretty much everything we do just becomes polarized. And so I think the one positive in having the conversations and finding folks, again, we're the same and different, is it starts to make us all feel a little less polarized. Not overnight. I know it's not like this utopia, but this is a start. Yeah.
Hi. So we have teenagers and then we also have toddlers. So we have an age disparity. So and we have all the things that you have with the parental controls and downtime starts at like 8:30 and we can control it from our devices and all that. But they're teenagers, so they're not supposed to use their phones in front of the younger kids. But when we leave the room, of course they do. So there's like this sort of now association with like mom and dad are not there, and then boom, like these things come out. So like, is that happening with your 8th grader at all around your younger children?
There are times where he has his phone. One way around it, and again, it's tricky, one way around it, so again, mine are like 14, 12, and 8. So sometimes what I will say, no different than I would hand over my phone to my 8-year-old to call a grandparent, oh, use your brother's phone. It takes away the sort of like stigma of like, I don't have. It also teaches the person whose phone it is technically that it's not only theirs in the sense, it's like we're all part of a family. And that's not answering your question, it's just an example of how we navigate it. I think I would encourage you to think of the framework of just sort of talking about responsibility in like a positive way. And you may be already doing some of this, so sorry, it's not anything like new and shiny. But you know, I could see it being sort of like a, I want to trust you with this, I want to know you can do it, and, you know, I don't want to turn this into like another reason why we have to set a boundary. I think you can do it, and I think you can sort of respect that this is a boundary we have as a family, and see how it goes. Maybe you tried it and it's bombed, I don't know.
No, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just try to spin it. I think the thing with teenagers is like, you say black, they're gonna say white no matter what. And it's like a lose-lose kind of a situation. And so, you know, personally, when that stuff comes up, even not tech related, I just try to like flip it on them in a way that's just like, you know, not saying it's I'm gonna be mad if, I'm gonna say, you know, I'm making them see it from another angle. Sorry.
Thank you.
I'll keep thinking on that one. I mean, I think the other thing, actually now that I'm thinking about it, the other way to look at it, or to think about it is, and I don't know your house configuration, you don't tell me, but another way to think about it is if you have something you really feel like you need to do on your phone, and I'm not in the room, come get me so I can stay, and you can leave the room. So, you know, you're drawing them, you're making them aware of the behavior, the need to use the phone. And so is it that urgent that they would come get you? And also if they do come get you, it's like, oh, thanks, I'm so glad you like honored that boundary. I'll absolutely stay here, come back when you're done and we'll swap. Kind of
That's a good
thing.
one. Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I'll keep thinking that. Anything else? Yes.
I have a teenager who's just learned to change all the passwords without informing the parents. And we just found out because I checked at 2 a.m. in the morning and I couldn't get in the phone. So I had Dad ask her. Because if I'd asked, it would have been World War III.
Exactly.
Yeah. Let him.
See, we're already starting
And
a
I
support
had my
group.
Let him navigate that, but that's another area where she's graduated from, okay, I can see this, I can see that, okay, there's screen time, okay, I can't have these apps, to, okay, I have a password, and I'm gonna change it. So what we've done is, we said, listen, we're gonna be in the honor system here. You're gonna get an upgraded phone, because my husband feels in his infinite wisdom, she needs the most advanced technology. Said, but we're going to need the passwords on everything you use. She agreed, we were good. A couple months later, I couldn't get in. So Dad had to go in there and ask. So one digit off, which was smart, but still. So how do we navigate that from the young child in elementary school as they make their way up to middle school, and there's that peer pressure, and oh, you have that app, maybe I can get that app too. How do I circumvent my parents' screen time? How do I move on? And now I've got the power of a password.
Yeah, so that's great. So one thing I actually do, my kids know my password on my phone. So that whole idea of like modeling from young, I tell them, you know, there are things I don't want other people to have access to, but I want you to be able to call Dad if you need to, or if for some reason, if there was something like I couldn't get to my phone, that you could get it. So that was one way I started trying just to model that, like, passwords aren't bad, like, we're gonna, as a family, we're gonna be open about our passwords. I think the other thing, I'm trying to think of your full question, because I focused on the password part, the app piece. The other thing, so in a lot of the devices, kids can just request an app. So Kindle does that. So one thing that we have as a rule in our house is don't send me the request until you come and talk to me. And so they have to come to my husband, and they have to come and tell me why you want it, tell me what you want to do. If I don't know it, we go online together and we look it up. And so from this age, I'm just trying to teach them that it's an open conversation. And there are times where I'm like, well, this looks really interesting, give it a try. I'd like you to try it next to me so I can, because I might not know it yet. There was a time where it really was on top of the apps, that's like long gone. And then it also just kind of, if there's other times where I said, you know what, this seems like an interesting app, can we talk about it in a week? Can we, like, I try to like also, that delayed gratification piece, like, and I'm a little bit strategic about that part. I don't like overthink it, but there are some things where I'm just like, that's a dessert app, and I don't want to do dessert today. There was one thing that they came to me with off of the Kindle, and it was like too Candy Crush-like, and I was like, this is dessert, like galore. We had that conversation, and I was like, I think, let's revisit that. You have some dessert on your Kindle right now, like, let's come back to that another week. So I don't know if that's like helpful in terms of like just framing it with the younger kids. I mean, I'd even say some of that could work with your teenager too. It's just like, you know, Dad and I aren't opposed to the apps. We might have strong feelings about it, but we want to have a conversation about it rather than you trying to hide it. It might not help. I'm
Well, they
sorry.
start reaching a sense of autonomy at that point, but knowing that you can plant the seeds when you're in the elementary level, I think it makes it so much easier when they get older, regardless of the autonomy. But I think the peer pressure thing slowly starts to creep in, and well, his mom or her mom, and it's just a little more challenging, but it's great to address it now, before they get much older.
So like as a parent who just finds this whole thing very overwhelming and very time consuming, neither of which like I feel like I have capacity to deal with at this stage, I just have just kind of like basically said, we don't do stuff, we're doing these things, like that's our which I don't know, I feel, you know, so I have friends that say, well, you know, we're modeling for them, we're showing them responsible usage, we're having them come and talk to us, and is there a window where, you know, they'll be more receptive to that, and then that window shuts, that I'm missing out on by being so, you know, anti, you know, social media?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I go back to the study I talked about with the digital limiters. They weren't the worst group in the bunch, so you're not. No, I think, you know, I think as long as you're having the conversations about your whys, this is why we are, like, involving the kids in, you know, like, we're not doing this right now. And I'm still trying to figure it out. Like, I think there's a part where we can be a little bit transparent. We don't have to go into, like, the deep, icky stuff about it, but I'm still trying to figure it out. What do you know about it? Like, I think engaging them and saying, well, what do you know about, you know, what your friends are doing, or, you know, whatever, and asking them to sort of contribute to it. And your question actually reminded me about something I neglected to say about the plan itself. When we're revising our plans, or the kids want something different, I'll say, go write it up for me. Like, to your point, I'm like, I'm done talking about this sometimes, or it's just overwhelming with everything else. I'll say, write it up. You guys go write up what you think the change should be, and then you can come and share it with me and Dad. And the cutest moments are when they're like, well, we wanted to really say this, but we knew you weren't going to do that because of what we talked about last time. So we put it this way, like, you know? But it's showing that they remember those conversations. So I don't think there's a window that's gonna close. I would just advocate for just, not every day, but like if they bring it up, if there's something that socially came up or something that they heard about, you know, my favorite question at any age, whether they're 3 or whether they're a teenager, is tell me more about that. Like, just not making assumptions about what's swirling around in their head, because inevitably, like, just saying, tell me more about that, 9 out of 10 times my kids go in a totally different direction than I anticipated. And I would have gone in a very different conversation with the conversation if I had jumped in, so. No, I think it's totally okay. It's hard. It's really hard. I always joke that these events need cocktails. I know it's like school functions and whatnot. I'm like, but if we're gonna get, I'm like, if we're gonna get like this vulnerable about our parenting, like the last thing we need to do is I did have a conversation with a parent recently who said, like, I'm mad I didn't think of this. They were like, we grew up, people were like, alcohol is like the worst thing in the world, like it's gonna, like, and I'm like, this parent was like, my kids and phones, it's like, they were having a similar situation with the sort of like, it wasn't a password thing, but the tricky part now is, which maybe you've run into, they can hide.
Isn't there a way with it, with a phone, could you just shut it down though? Like
Yes.
where they can't
Yes.
actually get in? So I would just shut it down until they give you the password, and that way,
Change the
you don't let me
Wi-Fi.
in, well, I don't let you in, you know, kind
Oh,
of thing.
I've done that.
Yeah.
It's hard. And again, this is the other part too, to kind of some what you're navigating. There's so much about individual personality with how it plays out. And so it's like the whole, like you had your first kid and you're like, oh, I kind of got this. And then you come home with the second and you're like, what?
What happened?
Just
Yeah.
happened here? Like I had this figured out and like, it's so different, you know? And it's like, you can feel like you have that plan and you're testing it out with what access you're given, even if they're 3, you know? And then it's sort of like, sometimes device specific. It's sort of like, well, this worked, but this whole other device, and in my house, I can give you a perfect example. Kindles were fine. Like some of the limited stuff we were doing with iPad was fine. Nintendo Switch was the like end of like, that was, and they were playing Mario Kart. It wasn't even like we were doing anything like wild and crazy, but there was something inherent about the different design of it, how they each, which were very different, interacted with it, that was one of those big moments where we were like, okay, we gotta rethink this plan. Like, I'm so glad we tried this out. We learned a lot, so how are we gonna rework this? And it was a big reconfiguration. It wasn't pretty, but you know, so you just sometimes, you don't know how it's all gonna play out. So did we cover it? Did we cover it? Here's the beginning.
I think I think there's so much.
There's so much.
Right, like, I think it's, like, you covered a ton though, like, thank you.
If you have other questions you didn't want to say, send them to Carissa, you can send them to me. You know, I'm happy to chat or connect or whatever, so.
Thank you.
I'll tell you one last other favorite in my house, and I don't know if we've run into this. And this happened tonight as I was leaving, so I'll fully admit this. I'm going to walk out the door, and my oldest goes, so do we get screen time after dinner? Well, they know that moment I'm out the door, and it's also, there's another parent sitting next to him. Like, it's like that whole, like, which parent is I gonna, if I say it out loud, so it's like, and oh, by the way, he also knows that there's no screen time during the week. It was just like, here's an opportunity. So I do all of these things, and it's still testing the boundaries. But that was I'm like, really? Really? Like tonight. So thank you all.
Thank you.